In the summer of 1914, Sarajevo appeared to be a typical, quiet European city going about its day. A single fateful gunshot fired on these streets cascaded into a global conflict that ultimately claimed over 15 million lives. This assassination functioned as the mechanical trigger for a geopolitical time bomb that European leaders had spent decades assembling. To understand the scale of the resulting destruction, we have to look past the gunmen and examine how the ruling empires wired the entire continent for its own collapse. At the turn of the 20th century, the British, French, and German empires expanded to control vast territories across Africa and Asia. The Industrial Revolution fueled this expansion. Mass production required an endless diet of raw materials to keep the European factories running. Innovations like steamships and telegraphs acted as a logistical nervous system, allowing governments to coordinate global extraction from thousands of miles away.
You can see the scale of this boom in the factory smokestacks that began to dominate the European skyline. By 1900, uncolonized land was disappearing. Empires had nowhere left to expand without stepping into each other's territory, forcing direct and highly aggressive competition. The pursuit of infinite industrial growth on a finite planet locked these nations into inescapable rivalries. This competition formed the rigid outer casing of a bomb. Inside those borders, national pride was mutating into a toxic belief that one's own people were innately superior to their neighbors. This superiority complex bred deep paranoia. Every rival empire's growth was viewed as a direct, existential threat to the nation. Acting on that paranoia, these empires poured their industrial wealth into their militaries. They built massive dreadnoughts, cast thousands of artillery cannons, and drafted millions of men into permanent standing armies. War transitioned from a worst-case scenario to an expected, inevitable event that leaders actively prepared for. These paranoid populations, equipped with industrialized military power, became the volatile payload waiting for a spark. To manage this tension, leaders relied on deterrence. Europe split into two heavily armed camps: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in the Triple Alliance, and France, Russia, and Britain in the Triple Entente. These treaties were legally binding. An attack on a single member automatically demanded full military retaliation from the rest of the bloc. This safety measure functioned like a tripwire. It ensured that any localized dispute would immediately pull the entire continent into the abyss. The friction was highest in the Balkans, where imperial borders collided and nationalist groups fought for independence. On June 28, 1914, the tripwire was hit.
Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized its massive army to defend its ally. Germany, bound by treaty, declared war on Russia, prompting France and Britain to join. Within days, the system collapsed into total war. The expectation of a quick victory was crushed by miles of static trenches. The environment itself was pulverized into a charred, unrecognizable landscape. To break the stalemate, nations deployed new technologies like armored tanks and poison gas. Soldiers were forced to equip primitive masks to survive the very air they breathed. The desperation eventually bled into the Atlantic, where German U-boats targeted civilian and commercial supply lines without warning. The destruction of these ships and the loss of American lives eventually forced the United States out of isolation and into the conflict.
By this point, the conflict had grown so large that it resisted any attempts at diplomacy. The logistical gears of mobilization, the train schedules and mass production lines, proved impossible to stop once they were in motion, leaving leaders to preside over a slaughterhouse that no longer responded to their commands. By late 1918, the empires were physically and economically exhausted. The guns fell silent, leaving behind a staggering loss of human life. At the peace negotiations in Versailles, a small group of victors designed the treaty as a punitive tool to crush the losing nations rather than reconcile with them. The systemic roots of the war, imperial greed and aggressive nationalism, remained intact. Colonial territories and resources were simply transferred to the winning empires. This peace failed to resolve the systemic flaws of 1914, leaving the same imperial pressures to fester until they exploded again 2 decades later.